A cool breeze came forth from across the top of the Valentinian wall. The guards who felt it were relieved to feel the cold air brush across their faces during the height of summer. Moments of silence were rare and appreciated by the guards stationed along the wall. They knew that although attacks happened, they were safe because the Chun were unable to break through the wall entirely. It was almost impossible due to their lack of siege weapons and small numbers. However, it had been a very long while since the last attack on the wall. Longer than usual. The guards stationed there didn't know what to think, while their capital would say the same thing. Just be glad that they aren't here right now, and enjoy the peace you have. Still, when you were stationed there, you were pampered by comfortable beds and good food, and the pay wasn't awful like other guard posts. When attacks came, they were dealt with by long-range weaponry. Attacking a Chun with melee weapons, one-on-one, was not a smart idea. They were stronger than the average human, and could easily overpower you. Luckily, they were slower, so if you played it smart, and relied on your speed, you'd make it out alive. The ideal thing to do was to outnumber them, or let the archers rain arrows down at them. But one-on-one, it was pure suicide. The guard finished explaining all of this to a new recruit, and as soon as he was done with his sentence, a horn blared from a distance. Well, kid, it looks like you'll get to see this in action. The new recruit peered out over the ocean desert as small black figures lined up side by side to create a line and went parallel to the ground from which they stood on. The line started from one side periphery of his sight to the other. Hey, I thought you said they only attacked in small numbers. The guard stayed silent. A couple of moments passed as the figures grew bigger. Wait here, the guard left and ran atop the battlements. The soldier looked to his left as soldiers ran to their stations. Many looked uneasy, but did their best to keep their calm. He could hear the hurls and moans of some men as they just bent over and let out their breakfast. He heard prayers to his right, and some men recited their last words to their mothers and wives. There was no sound of imperial pride like the young recruit was expecting. No atmosphere of glory and death. Grown men were replaced by young boys who simply wanted to be held by their mothers again. Hey! The recruit was brought back to reality by the sound of the guard who had left earlier. You remember what to do, right? The recruit nodded. Right, well, we shall see. Just be ready for anything. He then turned behind the recruit and began barking orders. The figures that had seemed such small moments ago were now completely visible. It was not a small group of raiders like he was told. Still, an entire army was organized and outfitted with siege equipment. The recruit went to grab the guards and was stopped by his voice. I know, damn it! Just do what you're told! The recruit then heard the sound of a whip hit the air and saw large rocks fly from the top of the wall and crash onto the ground where the Chun stood. Undeterred, the Chun rushed the wall with ladders, and the strongest among them just started to climb the wall altogether. The recruit tried to stay focused, but fear began to sink into his body, and his mind flashed with memories of his home and parents. All he wanted was more opportunities, better life, but not at this cost. Hold! Hold the line, you bastards! The recruit found himself mid-fight as the Chun bashed their way along the wall. The legions weren't holding. They didn't have the number advantage anymore, and ranged weapons weren't enough. The Chun were now on top of the wall and pushing back the resistance. Boy, come here! The guard grabbed the recruit and dragged him behind his shield. Take this! The recruit was handed a scroll with the imperial seal stamped on it. You must take this to the capital. The king of Ingersville must see this. Do you understand? The recruit nods. Then go! The guard turns around and rushes back to the shield wall, only to be slaughtered seconds later. With each blink, the recruit found himself at different parts of the wall, from atop the wall to the inside, then the exit. He found a horse, got on top it, and began to ride. As he rode off, he looked back to see Chun chasing after him, and arrows filling the air. He kicked the horse's sides, and its cries would fill the air as it sped up, only to be hit by a falling arrow. The recruit falls to the ground and collects arrows all throughout his back. Grasping for air, he turned his back to see Chun surrounding him. His eyes would close, never to open again. The wall would fall, and with it, Ingersville.
With the Sheed help,
the Chun would flood across the empire. The king of Inglesville would die fighting with his people at the capital. Hordes of refugees would flee across the border into Ormar, where they would be oppressed and ignored by its king, seeing them as useless farmers who neglected the care of their kingdoms until he entered the fray. Cyprian, a noble-born baby from the Aurelianus family, he'd watch as the king of Ormar, Comedian, destroy everything his father built. The brotherhood between the two kingdoms would plummet into an all-time low. The economy would be in shambles, and huge swaths of land would be lost to invaders. He saw the discontent between fellow citizens of the empire and their suffering, and decided to act. Comedian was not well liked within his own court, starting there. Cyprian would navigate carefully between conversations, and spot the noblemen most unhappy. Talking with them, a new conspiracy would begin. A new emperor must take the reins before the empire would die forever. With a noble backing secured, he then would approach the refugees offering support and a plan. It was either do or die for these refugees. They agreed to take part in his rebellion. Cyprian and his supporters would flee the capital, heading for the countryside in the middle of the night. There they would attack invading Chun, protecting villagers, garnering support for their cause by aiding the people. In one village, Cyprian would see a group of dwarves led by the clan leader, Artar. Artar would tell the story of a mountain being occupied by greedy rivals and his quest to retake his home. Being a compassionate man, and frankly, in need of decent blacksmiths, Cyprian would strike a deal with Artar, with service to the empire. He'd take his army and fight with Artar for his home. With a fully outfitted army and the Chun dealing with the resistance movement back in Inglesville, now was the time to strike. Cyprian would first start with small villages, and then towns, from towns to cities. In a relatively short time, he'd have the entire countryside of Ormar under his control, with a skill that outshined Valentinian himself. Before he could even move into bigger cities, he'd need decent mages. For that, he turns to the Sun Elves, renowned for their skill in the arcane arts. To convince them to supply him with a few mages, he'd need to offer them something that they couldn't refuse. There was talk of a lost city somewhere in the wilderness in the village he and his army were camping at. Curious as if this was something he could offer, he set out to find it. As he was packing up, an old man known as the town crazy approached him to be a guide. The second in command laughed, but Cyprian, not willing to turn down help, and considering perhaps this man knew something they did not, agreed. The old man led them directly to the entrance of the city. However, this was no regular entrance. It was a large stone pillar, blended into the mountainside. The old man approached the pillar, pushing on one side, which slid inwards. Cyprian followed and came across a huge city, carved from stone, that dwarfed the size of Ormar's capital. Knowing this was exactly what he needed, Cyprian thanked the old man and set off for the Sun Elf capital, giving them the location and getting not many, but a decent amount of mages. He would set off for the capital. Once there, he saw that the capital's huge walls were in the way. In response, he built a 500-foot trebuchet and allowed Ardar to name it and give the order to fire. With it finished, Ardar gave the order, and the walls fell. With the help of the mages and dwarven armor, Cyprian took the capital and was crowned emperor. His next steps were to follow through with his promise to Artar, so he headed for the mountains in the north, and with combined efforts of man and dwarf, they retook the capital and pushed the rivals back. Not stopping, and with Ardar back in power, both dwarf and man fought side by side, retaking Inglesville. Cyprian developed a new way of fighting, where he chooses when and where to fight the Chun, splitting off a small portion of his army to lead the Chun on a needless chase. Then once they were tired, he'd strike with his force on the ground, where he chooses. He'd also rely heavily on ranged weapons and dwarvish gunpowder, when he could. Artar allowed Cyprian to use it, but wouldn't give up the recipe, keeping it in the dwarven circle. With this new tactic, Ardar was able to outplay the Chun by using speed and only attacking when he wanted to. Eventually, the entire south would be retaken, and they'd have the Valentinian walls recaptured. Not seeing it as good enough, Cyprian wanted to push further, taking parts of the desert. This would prove to be an impossible task, and they'd only be able to get so far before the supply lines would be stretched. There weren't enough big cities to stay and resupply. Cyprian would eventually be forced to give up taking and incorporating the major cities by the border into the empire, and placing them under direct, strict imperial occupation. When Cyprian returned to Regulbium in Ormar, his first action would be to repair the economy. Artar, by this point dear friends with Cyprian, would tell him of fertile lands beyond the mountain to the east. Intrigued, Cyprian would set up flyers throughout the empire, calling for heroes to explore these strange lands to the east, and see if there was any economic potential. Artar would fall into hot water with other dwarves for his betrayal of secrecy. Still, due to Cyprian protection, they couldn't act on it. So now, hero that you've heard the call to tell me, would you answer?